You know, for a while, I genuinely believed I would probably avoid making another secrets video this year, in spite of them being some of my most popular and well-received videos. I guess in a sense I got kinda burned out after releasing 2 within the same year, but I truly do believe these are probably the most fun videos to make for me. To me, these videos aren't just meant to ape someone else's bit, but to truly showcase the special little insignificant things within a game for the love of it. And that's why I chose this game in particular, as Final Fantasy IX has remained as not only my favorite entry in the series, but also my favorite game of all time. So it's a game I have a lot of personal attachment to, and this year marks the game's 25th anniversary, which I figured would be the perfect time to finally go over as many secrets and lesser known facts about this game I could possibly dig up. I'll be doing my best to cover things you likely had no knowledge of, but let's begin by covering some of the things you may have heard of or even experienced yourself. Starting off with something featured very early on in the game. If you talk to these 3 triplets as Vivi, you can participate in a simple jump rope minigame at any time prior to meeting Prince Puck. In spite of appearing within the first hour of the game, it's become kinda infamous for being pretty brutal, as the girls continue to speed up more and more, with some extremely tight inputs to time your jumps properly later on. And even after like over a decade of playing this game, I can still only manage to do about 30 jumps. There's a variety of Tetra MasterCards you can get by hitting certain thresholds, and if you're somehow determined enough to do a full 1000 jumps in a row, you'll be rewarded with a special key item known as the King of Jump Rope. The item itself doesn't actually do anything, so it mostly exists for bragging rights, which I highly doubt the vast majority of players ever obtained. Later on in the game, you can redo the jump minigame with either Vivi or Aiko inside the bell tower, so you can also obtain the King of Jump Rope here if you like. Although the minigame itself isn't any easier at this point, so it's still a pretty uphill battle to get anywhere close to 1000 jumps. Even the game's own programmer, Hiroshi Kawai, was apparently not very good at this minigame, stating he could only manage 100 jumps, which is still more than double I could manage. Related to this, there's some special dialogue that appears if you manage to get at least 100 jumps during Steiner's section by speaking to this Moogle within the castle. As mentioned before, I'm complete dog water at this minigame, so big thanks to my buddy AJPG7 for helping me out with this. Another interesting secret you can find early on comes during Baku's explanation of the plan to kidnap Princess Garnet. Here, you can respond with the incorrect answer of kidnapping Queen Braun, and if you do this a total of 64 times, Ruby will enter the room exclaiming,
Zidane! Oh, I reckon you're more stubborn than a grumpy mule.
Next up is the Stellazzio side quest. These are hidden coins based on the zodiac signs you can collect throughout the game. You may have heard of these before if you've ever seen this classic image proudly proclaiming that you have received cancer. These coins can be given to a character known as Queen Stella in the city of Treno for various rewards such as Gil, the Blood Sword, Rosetta Ring, and the Robe of Lords. After you've obtained 12 of these, you'll have all of the coins returned to you, and by reading all of them together, you'll be given a hint towards the location of the secret 13th Stellazzio, which resides within Quan's dwelling in the exact same spot the Scorpio Stellazzio was previously found. After giving the queen the final Stellazzio coin, the player is rewarded with the Hammer, which is a weapon used exclusively by Senna. This item may seem useless on the surface, however it serves 2 unique purposes. The first is that if you manage to keep this item in your inventory after completing the game, it adds an extra scene to the final reprisal of I Wanna Be Your Canary, where Blanc is personally executed by Baku. The other use for the hammer is as a synthesis ingredient in a secret shop within the game's final dungeon, Memoria. In order to access this shop, you need to visit this spot within the underwater section, which has a mysterious character threaten the party if they don't leave. If you choose to ignore this request, you'll be met with a special boss fight against Hades, who isn't a particularly difficult opponent for this point in the game. After defeating him, he'll give you access to his synthesis shop, which has quite a few rare items, including the tin armor, the strongest defensive armor for Steiner, which requires the hammer as part of its recipe. Should you choose to make it, you'll permanently lose access to the hammer since there's only one in the entire game, so you'll have to choose between the tin armor or the secret scene. You can also use the hammer to downgrade a completed Pumice to a Pumice piece, although I'm not entirely sure what practical application this has. Hades himself is pretty fascinating for numerous reasons. He has a special line he says at the beginning beginning of his battle if the players defeated the game's super boss Ozma, implying there's some sort of connection between the two, although nothing in the game really expands on it. The other fascinating detail is why Hades is even here in the first place. If you're unfamiliar with him, you'll probably question the purpose behind his appearance here, since there's not really any real explanation given as to what he is in this game beyond being a legendary blacksmith. Well, as it turns out, Hades was originally the game's final boss based on this piece of concept art depicting him as such, before eventually being replaced by Nekron. This change likely happened pretty late into development, as the final arena still uses design elements reminiscent of Hades, such as these eyes seen on the walls, which can be seen on Hades' sword as well as many other areas throughout the game. Another interesting tidbit about Hades' shop is the fact that you can craft Save the Queen, a weapon used by Beatrix, which, similar to the hammer, cannot be equipped by any of the game's party members. However, unlike the hammer, Save the Queen actually serves no purpose, so I'm not entirely sure what you were meant to do with it. The most you can do with it is throw it with Amaranth, but to me that isn't exactly worth synthesizing this legendary weapon just to chuck it at a random enemy. Ipsen Castle has a pretty interesting secret involving this wall. Inspecting it will give you a bunch of different options to interact with it, and after enough attempts, Zidane will end up resting on the wall and falling through. This opens a secret area on the first floor featuring a puzzle that requires you to move each of these pieces counterclockwise, after which you're rewarded with an accessory known as the Ancient Aroma. This only has one ability called Odin's Sword, which allows Garnet's summon Odin to deal normal damage to bosses, as the normal version of the summon just instantly kills enemies, making it useless against all boss fights. Finally, there's Excalibur II. This is a secret sword for Steiner the player can obtain near the end of the game inside Memoria. Like other weapons found within Memoria, it's completely hidden until the player interacts with it. However, it only appears in Memoria if the player has managed to make it here in under 12 hours, meaning you essentially have to speedrun the entire game in order to obtain it. This task is especially difficult if you're playing on the game's PAL release, as that version runs much slower than any other release. The actual weapon itself is easily the strongest in the entire game, having 8 more strength than Zidane's Ultima weapon, and giving Steiner access to all of his best skills, which you're guaranteed to have missed up until this point. There's no real hint given towards this weapon's existence beyond a single rare Tetra Master card, but this hardly gives you an idea of how to obtain it, and as far as I'm aware, there's never been a definitive answer as to why this weapon exists or what the developer's intentions were behind it. The Final Fantasy series has never really seen anything similar to it ever again, so it remains one of the most interesting weapons in the entire franchise, although I think its existence is fairly well known at this point. Something that might be a bit lesser known is this early concept art, which depicts a vastly different design for the blade, making it closer in appearance to most of Steiner's non-knight swords like the Blood Sword or Flame Saber. Okay, now on to some of the more obscure stuff. How many of you are aware of the place Final Fantasy IX was first officially revealed? The game was first ever unveiled at a convention known as the Square Millennium event, held on January 29, 2000 in Japan. This event had quite a few demos for some of their upcoming PlayStation 2 titles, but more interesting was the reveal of the next 3 mainline Final Fantasy titles, as 9, 10, and 11 would all be announced simultaneously back to back. This was a pretty insane tactic for a company that would absolutely not work at all nowadays. But against all odds, all of these games somehow managed to be very successful. Unfortunately, Squaresoft barred any and all footage or pictures being taken, so there's not a ton of material from the event that surfaced. However, one rogue attendee did manage to record the entirety of the Final Fantasy X reveal trailer, which heavily differs from the final game, featuring a black-haired Titus, large open environments, and even mentions of online functionality. The actual trailer for Final Fantasy IX itself has never been seen in its entirety, so it's unknown what it contained. Although a very small snippet of the end of it was captured before 10's reveal, but it doesn't really illuminate much. Considering the fact the game only released 7 months later, it's unlikely it had many substantial differences. On the topic of the game's development, did you know that Final Fantasy IX actually began production before 8 had even finished? and was created as a sort of return to form for the series, abandoning the previous title's more sci-fi heavy themes in favor of more traditional high fantasy. Hironobu Sakaguchi, the father of the entire Final Fantasy series, has also gone on record to state that 9, at the time of its release, was his favorite game in the series, with him stating, quote, "It's my closest ideal view of what Final Fantasy should be." Back to the game itself, how many of you are aware of the Treasure Hunter rank? This is a relatively obscure mechanic you can only learn about in 2 areas. The inn in Treno by speaking to this woman, and the optional area Daggerio. Essentially, you're given a ranking depending on how many chests you've opened throughout the game from rank H to S, with a special item known as the rank S medal being given out if the player manages to reach the highest rank. I was never totally sure how this mechanic fully worked. For some reason, I had always thought it was affected by things like Zidane's steals, but the only criteria for increasing it is opening up chests, and you get slightly more points for opening up Chocograph chests specifically. Outside of the special key item, there's not much incentive to achieve a high rank. So like the jump rope, it's more for bragging rights than anything else. On the topic of Daggerio, there's a very interesting thing you can do here that I've rarely seen anyone discuss. If you examine these books to the far right and speak to this old man, he'll move out of the way and allow you to access a hidden ladder, which you can use to head down to the middle section of Doggerio and speak to this man, who will allow you to rename any party members so long as you have the Naming Way Tetra Master card in your inventory. The Naming Way card itself is extremely rare and can only be found in one spot inside Kuja's room within the Desert Palace. And as this area becomes inaccessible later, it's likely most players wouldn't be able to access this feature. Naming Way himself is directly linked to a character of the same name from Final Fantasy IV, who served a similar purpose of renaming characters. However, no actual version of Naming Way appears within Final Fantasy IX, so this card serves entirely as a homage. 9 itself is chock full of references to almost every other game in the series prior. As mentioned before, they really meant for this game to be somewhat of a celebration of the series' roots, so the game is chock full of references to the whole franchise. Some of these are pretty obvious, like Garnet's white mage robe at the beginning of the game. Garland is a pretty clear homage to the series' first ever antagonist, Garland, although this homage was originally a lot clearer in Garland's initial concept art, which bears a much closer resemblance to his classic appearance. The 4 major boss fights you fight within Memoria before Kuja are an allusion to the 4 fiends present within the original Final Fantasy. The area Pandemonium in Terra is a direct callback to the final area of Final Fantasy II, also known as Pandemonium. And probably one of the most obscure is this Easter egg you can only see if you have the items Doga's Artifact and Une's Mirror, which can only be obtained at the auction house in Treno on Disc 4. If you have both of these items in your inventory and head back to the Black Mage Village, you can speak to this Black Mage near this phonograph inside the inn, and an entirely new song will begin playing throughout the village. This is actually a rendition of a song featured in Final Fantasy III known as Honestly, there's so many little references, obscure and obvious, that it's not really worth going over all of them. These are just the ones I thought were the most notable. Okay, how many of you are aware of Final Fantasy IX's hidden multiplayer feature? I wouldn't exactly blame you if you didn't, since the game doesn't outwardly showcase its existence. In order to activate it, you need to edit the Battle Control option in the config menu. From here, you can designate each of the game's 8 party members between player 1 and 2 for use in battle, essentially meaning you can split up the game's entire playable cast between you and a friend. Believe it or not, this is actually yet another homage to the series' past, as Final Fantasy V and VI both featured this exact same mechanic, only to be dropped in 7 and 8. If you've played this game before, then there's no doubt you've encountered a unique ability, Guardian Mog, which is exclusive to Ico. The game itself has no explanation for what this ability does, as its only description reads, Mog protects with unseen forces, which doesn't exactly paint a clear picture of its purpose. What Guardian Mog actually does is heal any status ailment inflicted on Ico after battle. I'm not entirely sure why they decided to make this ability's description intentionally vague, since it overall isn't a particularly strong one. Still, it's an interesting little quirk exclusive to Ico. How many of you have intentionally bothered the game's save Moogle on the world map? If you routinely call the Moogle without saving, they will gradually get more and more annoyed at the player with lines like, "I'm sharpening my knife, Kupo," eventually culminating in this line every time you call them without saving. There's a special area you can access with the golden chocobo known as Chocobo's Paradise, which you can unlock by using a dead pepper on this mountain on a small unmarked island in the top left corner of the map. Here you can speak to the fat chocobo, and if you've obtained all the chocographs and dead pepper treasures, and challenge him at Tetra Master, he'll offer a special reward for visiting every single beach in the game. If you do so and visit every lone beach within Gaia and press circle on each one, you'll gain the ability to fully heal all HP and MP by simply visiting any beach and pressing circle. A fairly useful ability in theory, although it's unlikely you'll ever be able to get much out of it considering how late into the game it becomes available. Alright, this next topic is not exactly a secret within Final Fantasy IX itself, but it was so funny and fascinating to me that I felt the need to talk about it. The official Brady Games strategy guide for FF9 has become quite infamous for its use of a service known as Playonline. This was an online subscription created by Squaresoft for games like Final Fantasy XI and Front Mission Online. However, it also hosted a bevy of original content like an online version of the Tetra card game, although this one played fairly differently to the one seen within Final Fantasy IX itself, as rather than simple one-on-one duels, the game was instead played with 3 players at a time. You could buy packs or wager in-game money on matches too. It honestly seemed like a pretty cool service if you're one of those creeps who actually liked Tetra Master. For some reason, it also featured characters from Final Fantasy X, likely just to help extend the game's total card list. Unfortunately, that service along with most of the other ones offered by this platform are now defunct, with the only remnant being Final Fantasy XI, as that game actually still uses the service. As for the strategy guide, for some bizarre reason and what I assume was an attempt to get more people onto the service, the book heavily requires the use of Playonline. Basically, every single page of the guide in some way will refer you to the Playonline service. Want to learn about the frog catching side quest? Go to Playonline. Want some tips on how to fight this boss? Go to Playonline. Want to learn how to fight this secret, special, optional boss fight? Go to Playonline. Pretty much any time the guide has the opportunity to do so, it will demand that you go to Playonline and type in some passkey to get really basic information, instead of it just already being present within the book you just spent money on, which I imagine almost certainly pissed off a lot of people to have this pricey guidebook redirect you to a service you may not have access to. While obviously pretty frustrating back then, Brady Games would eventually amend this with the Final Fantasy X strategy guide not requiring the use of Playonline at all. Regardless, the Final Fantasy IX strategy guide has remained a pretty fascinating part of the game's history, even if it's only in the States. Back to the actual game itself, there are 2 pretty rare ATEs the player is unlikely to ever see on their own. The first happens early on in Disc 3 in Lindblum. Before you board the Blue Narcissus, if you have under 50 gil, you'll get a special scene with Baku having to pay for Quina's food. The other can occur at the very end of Disc 3 within Pandemonium. If you fail this puzzle with the rotating block enough times, you'll be given the option to have the currently benched party members change the angle for you without having to go back to the previous room. This is honestly pretty helpful, although considering there are only 5 possible angles, it's pretty unlikely for you to ever require this. For this last part, I want to talk about the game's final boss, Nekron. As mentioned before, the original game's final boss was Hades at some point, but there's actually another unused final boss idea, and that was to just have an actual Grim Reaper, essentially meaning the game's final boss originally started out as Death itself, then Hades, the god of the dead, and then finally an original character who essentially embodies both themes. Nekron is somewhat disliked by a lot of people for how abrupt his appearance is within the game, but if there's one thing I'll always remember, it's the fact that for some reason, Nekron near word for word quotes Yoda from Star Wars The Phantom Menace.
Leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering.
Lastly, there's a pretty interesting mechanic about the fight with Nekron that I've rarely seen mentioned or even used by people, and that's the fact that you can actually opt to not have Zidane in the party for the battle. Yeah, for some odd reason, you can choose to not have the game's protagonist, who is near guaranteed to be one of, if not your strongest party member all around, not to be in the game's finale. This even changes the pre-fight dialogue, with the person who says it changing depending on the game's internal priority system. By default, default, Zidane has the most, but second is actually Aiko, with Steiner having the third most and Vivi having the fourth. I find it kinda odd how Garnet is somehow on the lowest end of the game's priority, with Freya having more than her somehow. Okay, now for the juicy bits of cut content within Final Fantasy IX. Well, I say juicy, but 9 itself is somewhat bare bones in this regard compared to many of the other titles I've covered on this channel. However, there are still some fairly interesting tidbits. For example, there is a scrapped mini-game for Vivi during Disc 3 similar to the Jump Rope where you collect balloons from children in Alexandria. It's almost entirely complete, so it's unclear as to why it was scrapped so late into development, although just from watching it, the mini game itself doesn't exactly look like the most stimulating thing, so it's not exactly a huge loss. Cinna, a temporary party member for the earliest parts of the game, has a dedicated menu portrait along with his own victory animation. However, neither are able to be seen during normal gameplay. I think this is likely here as more of a failsafe than an indication of a bigger role for Cinna, as the other two members of Tantalus who join the party briefly, Blank and Marcus, do have their own portraits and victory animations used, so these likely exist in case you ever needed to open the menu or win a real battle with Cinna in your party. There are quite a few unused scenes left within the game, some of which still exist and can be re-enabled with a patch, while others only exist as text. Probably the most interesting one relates to a small choice you can make early on within Disc 1. Before entering the Evil Forest, Zidane has an option to either look for Garnet or forget about it. Regardless of your choice, Zidane ultimately decides to save her. However, originally, if the player chose to forget it, Zidane would seemingly have a nightmare about Garnet before deciding to save her. There are a few other interesting scenes, such as one featuring Freya speaking to the King of Burmecia, and another where Zidane is almost caught by an Alexandrian soldier and has to pretend to be a cat to avoid notice. Probably the weirdest one is an unused game over text for the final boss, which reads, "The Leafa tree could not be stopped. Gaia and Terra's fusion caused global chaos, destroying many cities and taking many lives." Some of the scenes that only have dialogue left over are somewhat interesting as well, such as this removed scene in Dali, where Zidane uses the mayor's key to help find Vivi after he gets kidnapped. In the final game, the path to Vivi is via this hatch that isn't locked in any way, and the mayor key is an optional item the player can only obtain on Disc 3, during the Tetra Master Tournament in Trena, where it can be used to open up this area in Dali for a free 30,000 gil. This is the only time in the entire game you can obtain the mayor's key and collect this chest, so unless you're privy to this information, you'll likely never find the mayor's key on your own. Either way, this unused dialogue heavily implies that the mayor's key served as an actual mandatory item needed to progress. Some other interesting dialogue to note include this line, which suggests the summoned Carbuncle for Aiko would have been obtained at the Leafa tree rather than Leviathan for Garnet. It also specifies that the item is temporary, so it's possible this was only to be used during the ending sequence of Disc 2. Dialogue with Kuja inside Mount Gulag heavily implies that Garnet was the one having her Eidolon stolen once again, with Thorn specifically calling for Odin. There's a substantial amount of unused dialogue past this, but it's mostly minor stuff or slight revisions of scenes already present in the game, so if you're interested, I'll leave a link down below. On the subject of early dialogue, there exists an early script for the very beginning of the game posted by Sakaguchi in late 2010. The script is dated July 17th, 1998, a full 2 years before the game's release, and it contains some fairly notable differences, although the basic idea remains the same for the most part. Movie 1, the game's opening, is described here as a simple panning shot showing the game's world rather than Garnet's dream. When Vivi gets introduced, he's said to be at a theater ticket office rather than a simple booth seen in the final game. He then meets a character known as Rat Kid of the Rat family, and the two sneak into a play that is described as being a moonlight love romance. This description seems to imply that the I Wanna Be Your Canary play was completely different at this stage in development. Also mentioned here is a scrapped movie 4, which places an odd amount of focus on Garnet's chest, followed by this exchange between Zidane and Blanc. Weird focus on her breasts aside, Zidane here makes specific mention to the Legend of Leviathan in regards to Garnet's pendant. This line heavily implies that Leviathan once had a significantly bigger role in the story at one point. This is supported by Carbuncle seemingly being in his place initially. While it's unknown what Leviathan's original role in the story was, it's possible he was eventually replaced with Alexander, who does actually relate to Garnet's pendant. After that, Steiner gets introduced and begins looking for Garnet. Notably, Zorn appears here, but no mention of Thorn, likely meaning the idea of twin jesters didn't exist at this point. There's also not a single mention of Beatrix or any character in her place, so she likely didn't exist either, which is pretty interesting since she's a pretty important character for much of Disc 1 and 2. Following that, everything plays out fairly identically to the final game, however there's an interesting change near the second Steiner fight that mentions he was joined by Paladins, seemingly an early version of Steiner's Knights of Pluto, but more interesting to me is that it states the fight involves, quote, attacking Steiner and a Paladin from both sides, something which doesn't happen at all in the final game. This is a mechanic that is present in games like Final Fantasy VI and VII, but was completely absent from both 8 and 9, meaning that they likely wanted to reintroduce it here, but this never came to fruition. Outside of that, there are some more dialogue and other related small changes, but the basic story outline here is pretty much identical to the final. Still, it's a pretty interesting read, so I'll leave a link in the description if you want to read it for yourself. Another fascinating tidbit left within the game are unused enemy IDs, which reveal that the other Guardians of Terra, the Fire Guardian, Wind Guardian, and Water Guardian, were originally all going to be fought as actual boss fights. In the final game, the only one you actually fight is the Earth Guardian, while the others are defeated off-screen by various party members. This seems to imply that you may have actually fought each of the 4 Guardians yourself. Concept art for these unused boss fights exists, which do resemble the Guardian seen in the final game, albeit a bit more simplistic. On that note, Final Fantasy IX has some pretty interesting concept art. Some of the earliest pieces of concept art created for the game depict a vastly different looking title, seemingly featuring job classes, which visually resemble Final Fantasy Tactics more than anything seen in 9, including these really awesome Dragoon designs based on Bahamut and Leviathan. There's these 3 pieces I really like which depict what they refer to as funny people, which seemingly just refers to the different non-human races you see throughout the game, including an early designed for Quina's unnamed race, as well as this really fucked up looking fellow who I don't think ever made it into the final game. Concept art of some of the main characters exist who have vastly different designs, including a dark-skinned Garnet, who has another piece depicting a creature known as Lolo, who may have been some sort of early Eidolon. Okay, I actually want to clarify that this character isn't 100% confirmed to be the original Garnet, but she does at the very least seem to be one of the game's main characters based on her frequent appearance in other pieces. Moving on, we have a character known as Fencer, who appears to be one of the earliest ideas for Zidane, who at this point lacked a tail and had a completely different outfit, although a lot of the basic colors stuck around. A character known as Fairy Child, who appears to be a very early version of Aiko, sporting a radically different design, which honestly resembles something Nomura would have drawn. I do really like this stupid shit-eating grin she has. A Burmesian Dragoon, who seemingly evolved into Freya, as well as this Black Mage design, which doesn't really resemble the game's generic Black Mages at all. Another piece depicting some early designs for the Black Mages along with the original Zidane and Garnet, known as Black Robbers Are Approaching. Unfortunate naming aside, this piece seems to indicate that the Black Mages were some sort of mischievous group of thieves, which is vastly different to the solemn tools of war seen in the final game. There's also this insane piece depicting a couple designs for early female Alexandrian soldiers, including one with a pumpkin head for some reason. There's a few interesting pieces that are closer to the final that still have some notable differences, like these early designs for Garnet's outfit and hairstyle. Quina's concept art has a slightly different design with a blue color scheme and no bib. A few unused enemies have concept art like this sheep, whose docile appearance leads me to think they may have been a scrapped friendly monster. A honeycomb, which seemingly would have spawned small bees to attack. Additionally, this art seems to feature another depiction of the early Garnet design. Shizuku Samurai, which seems to be a flying enemy which unsheaths the sword hidden beneath it. And finally there's Moto Jacket, a pretty unique looking cartoony monster that I honestly honestly kinda like. I wish they kept this thing around in some way. Okay, before we move on to this next part, I want to quickly make mention of the Gaming Intelligence Agency. You may or may not have noticed that a good portion of the concept art seen here bears a watermark reading GIA. So I did some light digging and found out that they were a very old, now seemingly defunct gaming organization who posted reviews and gaming news and stuff like that. Well, I'm not sure how this organization came upon these, but they actually originally leaked Final Fantasy IX's existence all the way back on March 15th, 1999. They claim here to have a reliable source who not only leaked aspects of a trailer containing a little guy with a big hat, wide brim, and pointy top, and additionally gave them some confidential concept art that to this day has never been posted anywhere else, not even by Square Enix themselves. Hence, they are the only source for most of the concept art we've seen in this video, and I thought that was pretty fascinating, so I figured I'd point it out. There's a few pieces of art depicting some areas that never made it into the final game, including a couple spots in Burmecia that were scrapped, a marketplace in Limblum that was never fully realized, an insane piece of art depicting an area known as the Demon Waterfall. I have no idea where this area was meant to appear, but it does look very cool, so I'm curious as to what purpose it originally served. A giant tree with a village at the top of it, possibly related to the final game's Lifa tree, and finally an area known as Last Dungeon, seemingly being a final dungeon created before Memoria. While not directly linked to anything in the final, it does bear a strong resemblance to the area where Kuja and Zidane end up during the game's ending inside the Lifa tree. This area, combined with another piece that shows Gaia's crystals within the roots of the Lifa tree, may imply that at some point, the game's final dungeon may have taken place entirely within the tree. The last thing of note in regards to cut content relates to the game's ending. According to the game's lead designer, Kazuhiko Ooki, the game's ending changed about 7 times. Now, he doesn't specify anything specific since at the time this interview happened, Final Fantasy IX had yet to even release, so they purposely avoided saying anything else, although they do state the basic idea remained the same. Based on the early script we have, I think what he's saying here is likely accurate, and the ending probably didn't go through too many radical changes. That being said, I still am extremely curious as to what in particular changed about the ending, since to me it's one of the most iconic parts of the game, so it really does make me wonder what some of their earliest revisions may have looked like, and how they could have changed the overall story presented. I still do really adore the game's ending and don't want it to be changed at all, but I am really curious as to what they had in store originally. Alright, now we've arrived at what I believe are the most obscure facts present within Final Fantasy IX, starting with the skill Thunder Slash. This is a late game sword art ability for Steiner that deals damage based on 19% of Steiner's total HP. A pretty basic skill, but one that doesn't work as intended due to a glitch that for some reason makes the move's base accuracy 0. From my extremely basic testing, this move only hit once out of 9 different attempts, making it a pretty worthless skill. Notably, this skill is still completely broken in all modern releases of the game, so maybe they consider it a feature at this point. Funnily enough, Beatrix's version of the skill works normally as a boss, but as a temporary party member, just like Steiner, hers also has 0 accuracy. How many of you are familiar with a quirk regarding how the game tracks time? Well, I mean, it's kinda hard for you not to notice this in-game timer whenever you open the game's menu. However, something very unique happens if you manage to make it over the 100-hour mark. The timer will roll over and completely change color. By default it is white, but once you reach 100 hours it'll change to red, and it will continue to change should you hit another 100-hour mark. Essentially it goes like this. White is for anything below 100 hours, red is for your first 100 hours, then yellow for 200 hours, then blue for 300 hours, then purple for 400, and finally green for 500 hours, which is a frankly ridiculous amount of time for any game, let alone a PS1 title. If you manage to go above the 500-hour mark, then the timer will glitch for exactly 1 hour before correcting itself to show the green timer again, although it now remains static. However, if you were to wait approximately 2.9 years to pass, then the timer will overflow and reset back to the original white timer. This means you could theoretically obtain Excalibur II by doing this, but the insane time cost doesn't make it the most ideal method. Still an incredibly funny option if you're enough of a sociopath to desire this route. In Disc 3, after obtaining the Blue Narcissus, if you visit the North Gate near Burmecia with Freya in your current party, a rainbow will appear in the background. This rainbow only spawns once, as if you leave the area and return, it will disappear. It also only appears on Disc 3 specifically, so after entering the Shimmering Islands, this Easter egg no longer becomes available. Midway through Disc 1, inside Gizmaluk's grotto, there's this Moogle couple that you can help, which unlocks a save point for the area. If you decide to revisit these two periodically, then you'll actually see that the pair had children. You can gradually see the family grow disc by disc before it caps out at 3 little Moogle kids by Disc 4. Pretty cute Easter egg, and one you're likely never going to see, as there's virtually no reason to ever revisit Gizmaluk's grotto. Okay, how many of you are aware of the secret Blackjack minigame? It's a secret you can only access at the very end of the game, literally at the end screen. To unlock it, you need to press R2, L1, R2, up, cross, right, circle, down, triangle, L2, R1, R2, L1, square, square, start. There's no crazy Balatro style gimmicks, you just play a standard game of blackjack until you lose all available bankroll to bet. There's no reward for doing anything here, so you're essentially just playing it for fun, and as a slight gambling addict, I do find some enjoyment in the minigame. I especially like how some of the cards use characters like the fat Chocobo for the king or Shiva for the queen. While this may seem like a strange inclusion on the surface, it's actually yet another reference to the series' past, as a similar minigame existed all the way back in the original Final Fantasy that you could unlock by pressing A and B together 55 times. Alright, how many of you are aware of the coffee side quest? Unless you've read a walkthrough or the previously mentioned strategy guide, it's unlikely you've ever fully engaged with this side activity. Essentially, there are 3 extremely rare coffees you can find throughout the game. The first one is located at Bowden Arch near Chocobo Forest, the second in Maiden Sari inside Aiko's kitchen. The third and final coffee is where the quest gets pretty dickish. Remember that Mayor's Key side quest we discussed earlier? Well, if you check the same chest that contained the 30,000 gil, you'll find the final coffee hidden there. I want to remind you that not only is there virtually nothing else like this in the game, but the Mayor's Key itself can only be obtained during Treno's Tetra Master tournament, and if you miss it there, you are never able to get it again. If you somehow manage to get all of the coffees, then you can deliver them to Morid, who lives near Dali. Giving Morid the coffee will reward you with a theater ship model, which is useless outside of raising your treasure hunting rank. Another thing to note is that you cannot complete this quest on Disc 4, as after entering the Shimmering Islands, the area where Morid resides is permanently blocked off, even if you have all of the coffees. Morid is actually said to have died in between these events, and if you give him the coffee, he mentions that he can finally see his deceased wife in peace. So at the very least, by completing this questline, you're able to give a sense of closure to a character, even if they aren't a particularly memorable or important one. On the topic of obscure and obtuse questlines within this game, there is one that easily takes the cake, and it's something that was genuinely so insane and convoluted that it wasn't discovered for almost 13 years. The Lost Nero family questline. This begins almost immediately into Disc 4. Essentially, after hitting very specific points during Memoria, you can leave the area and head to Lindblum's Theater District, where you will be met with a member of the Nero family, characters who appear very sporadically throughout the game as members of Tantalus. If you manage to repeat this 9 times in a row, then when you enter their hideout, you'll find a new chest containing a Protect Ring, which is a pretty rare endgame accessory. The only other way to obtain one without synthesizing is via the Mognet Central questline, which is another relatively obscure, although a lot more well-known questline. This is an area you can only access after obtaining a gold chocobo. If you use a dead pepper on this cracked spot on an island above the outer continent, you can open up the Mognet Central, which is the area where all of the Moogle mail you get throughout the game comes from. However, when you arrive, the facility is currently shut down due to one of their machines breaking down. In order to fix it, you need to head to Alexandria and begin a small mail trade chain, starting with this Moogle named Kupo. After hitting a few spots, you'll eventually end up back at Kupo, who believes the answer to save Mognet Central is an item known as the Super Slick, which can be obtained by talking to Ruby. Delivering the Super Slick to Mognet Central rewards the player with a free Protect Ring. The Mognet Central questline can take a little bit of time to complete, but it is a far easier method to obtaining a Protect Ring than the Lost Nero family quest. Listen, I love this game if that wasn't obvious enough from this video, but this quest is genuinely awful. Virtually any time you do anything in Memoria, make any sort of progress, you need to walk your ass all the way back to Lindblum to see an event. event. This probably isn't a huge issue on modern ports of the game where you can just disable random encounters or turn on 2x speed. However, I'm a real OG Final Fantasy IX fanatic, so I played the original for this video, and had to deal with constant random battles just to make it back to Lindblum. There's even quite a few spots where you have to enter a room, view a scene, leave, then return to that same room, view another scene, and then leave again. It is an insanely monotonous quest. Fortunately, you only have to hit 9 of these events in a row to complete the quest, but if you're feeling particularly masochistic, you can actually do another set of these to do the quest again and obtain another Protect Ring. As mentioned before, this quest was pretty much unknown for more than a decade due to just how strange and unclear the conditions were. The first time I myself and many others had ever heard of this questline was a long-forgotten game trailer show known as Pop Fiction, which covered a lot of popular video game myths and secrets to see if there was any truth behind them. Despite its simple premise, it was a pretty decent little series that covered some pretty interesting and relatively obscure stuff, including the lost Nero family. This video is likely the first ever major publication of this information, as the only other place it was known to be in was the Japanese-only Final Fantasy IX Ultimania, although I do want to correct one slight error they made in this original episode. Here, they state that there were only 17 events in Memoria that trigger the questline, so you couldn't properly repeat it, which is false, as there are indeed 18 events within Memoria the player can trigger to redo the questline if they desire. Now, I don't really blame them for getting this wrong, as at the time, documentation and understanding of this questline was still pretty new. Tangent aside, the Lost Nero family questline is arguably one of the most obscure questlines in the entire Final Fantasy series, and while it isn't very good, I'll at least give the developers some points for being able to keep this hidden for so long. Alright, before we get into what I believe is the weirdest little secret within Final Fantasy IX, there's one more thing I wanted to briefly talk about. We earlier discussed the online version of Tetra Master via Playonline, but there is also an actual physical version of the game as well. Although unlike the online version, this one has very little documentation. From what I can tell, it doesn't have special rules and was mostly faithful to the game version, which means it unfortunately probably wasn't very good. For some odd reason, it was only released in Germany, so maybe they have a higher than average Final Fantasy fan ratio that I'm unaware of. The game does have some other cool merchandise like this notepad based on the game's save book. Recently, for the game's 25th anniversary, we've seen an entirely new line of merchandise, including this cute little picture book about Vivi and some new artwork. While we're on the topic of commercialism, how many of you have seen the iconic Final Fantasy IX Coca-Cola ad, which was fully animated by the same team who created the game's CG cutscenes? It even had music composed by Nobuo Matsu himself, and as such is featured on the game's official soundtrack. Alright, on to our last topic for this video. I assume most of you watching this video are familiar with the Ragtime Mouse enemy. You can find them all throughout the game randomly in any forested area on the world map. When you get into a battle with one, you'll be given a true or false question, usually involving some in-universe piece of lore. However, our focus here isn't on any of the questions themselves, but rather this little card the enemy holds. It's virtually impossible to make out what is on it, but the card does contain Japanese text that reads, "Pop Quiz. FF10's theme is Guts. True or false?" FF10 obviously referring to Final Fantasy X, which was actively in development around the same time as 9. Notably, this isn't actually a question Ragtime Mouse ever asks, although it's possible it was one at one point, or it was simply an Easter egg only meant to be seen by the developers. Either way, the question itself was kinda interesting, since there's no theme in Final Fantasy X known as Guts. Although the term theme here could mean like a thematical theme, in which case it also doesn't really make sense, since I wouldn't describe one of Final Fantasy X's themes as guts. Either way, I do think that teasing the series' next entry within the previous one is pretty cute. One last little side note, the exact amount of EXP you receive from Ragtime Mouse if you get every answer correct is actually a gag, as he gives out exactly 5,963 experience points, which in Japanese can be read as Go Ku-ro-san, meaning good job, which is the exact catchphrase used by Ragtime Mouse. And with that, we've covered just about every single little thing I could find for Final Fantasy IX. Although I'm sure there's still some other stuff I missed or just didn't feel the need to talk about in depth. Like, did you know the game was inspired by Jim Henson and Frank Oz's classic film, The Dark Crystal? As a massive fan of Jim Henson, this fact pleases me greatly, but outside of that, I've pretty much covered everything I've wanted to. Final Fantasy IX is still my favorite game of all time, and my appreciation for it has only increased while making this video. A Final Fantasy IX remake has been rumored for what feels like forever now. The existence of it came to be known via an Nvidia leak featuring a bunch of other Square Enix titles, all of which have now been released and announced except for a Final Fantasy IX remake. Square Enix did recently can several projects, so it's possible Final Fantasy IX was among them. Although with how popular and beloved this game is, I'd be shocked if it was one of the titles they canned. Regardless of whether or not the remake comes out, I'll still always find myself returning to the original PlayStation version, even if it's not perfect. I adore this game with my entire soul, and if you've made it this far into the video, I assume you also hold some level of appreciation for it. So I hope you enjoyed and learned a lot about the game in the process. I mean, maybe it's possible you already knew a lot of this stuff if you're one of those freaky little dudes who completes achievements, but either way, I appreciate you for sticking around this long. Sincerely, thank you for watching.